Thank you. No, it is absolutely a delight to be here. I want to say, I have 2 bottles of water. That's exciting. I want to say how much I admire Jeffrey. Seriously, what he has done here is absolutely amazing. And what you have here is absolutely amazing and should get much more attention. I'm going to try and help get more attention for it. Got a little bit of a tour this morning, but the way that he has turned this into a literary oasis, a mecca, is fantastic. And when I was walking through the book room today of Dalkey Archive, to be reminded of the amazing work that Dalkey Archive has done over the years, and American Book Review. I first joined the National Book Critics Circle in 1985, sitting next to the distinguished Elizabeth Hardwick, who used to say, when are we ever going to talk about books? It's all business, you know. But so I've been doing that for a long time. I remember Rochelle Ratner and Ron Stukanik of American Book Review, another amazing publication. So no kidding around. I really love being here and seeing what you have here. Let me tell you a little bit. So thank you to Jeffrey for inviting me, and thanks to the university. Let me tell you a little bit about this book. It took me 10 years to write this book, from original conception to finally getting it published. Had a lot of fights about it. My publisher, a very distinguished publisher called Alfred A. Knopf, said, well, we can't have philosophy in the title. That will kill it right away. And we've got to have a subtitle so people will understand what it means. I fought those battles, and I managed to get them just to stick with America the Philosophical, which I saw as an oxymoron, a contradictory phrase for a lot of people who think America is very unphilosophical. And this is a book against the grain that claims, as you'll hear in my verbatim language, that we are, in fact, the greatest philosophical culture in the history of the world. I actually believe that. And I have had tomatoes thrown at me for believing that. So I worked on this for 10 years. I said, we don't need a dopey subtitle. Dopey subtitles often keep people from looking at a book. Let them look at the title and try to figure out, what's in there. At first, the philosophers around the country were delighted. Wow, a book celebrating us. But then they kind of figured out that part of my argument is that America is a great philosophical culture, not because of philosophy professors, but in spite of philosophy professors. And that there's a lot of philosophy going on, outside the philosophy discipline. So what I want to do in the time I have, I'm going to go about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit less. I know students have to leave, and then we can take a break, have a question and answer session. I do want you to hear some of the language from the introduction. This is a reading series, but I'll mainly talk about the book. But I think I'll give you a little bit of the flavor of the language from the introduction and then walk you through the rest of the book. As Jeffrey said, I was extraordinarily fortunate. I come from humble circumstances. Neither of my parents went to college. The fact that my book ended up on the front page of the Times Book Review is probably the best thing that has ever happened to me in my life, in my career. A lot of good things have come out of it, but I do not at all feel like an entitled person. I work hard. I hope good things will happen. And I'm open to a lot of the criticism of the book. I've done a lot of speaking about it, and I have a big book tour. It's possible for reasonable people to disagree with many of my theses. So I hope some of you do. This is how the book begins. America the Philosophical, it sounds like Canada the Exhibitionist, or France the Unassuming. A mental miscue, a delusional academic tic, a dead-on-arrival concept emitting gases of pure intellectual wish fulfillment. Everyone knows that Americans don't take philosophy seriously, don't know much about it, don't pay attention to it, and couldn't name a contemporary academic philosopher if their passports depended on it. As historian Richard Hofstadter dryly observed in his Pulitzer Prize-winning Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, 1963, quote, in the United States, the play of the mind is perhaps the only form of play that is not looked upon with the most tender indulgence. But the tidal phenomenon of Hofstadter's classic, indeed boasts, in his view, a long historical background. The peculiar attitude directed at philosophy in America is more quizzical than hostile, closer to good-humored wariness than contempt. Philosophy doesn't threaten or bother the practical on-the-go American. The American middle manager confronted with a devoted philosophy type is most likely to yank out the old cliche, what are you going to do, open a philosophy store? And leave it at that. If, of course, the information has been accurately downloaded. Tell your seatmate on a flight that you're in philosophy, and the reply is likely to be, oh, that's great. My niece is in psychology too. Anyway, skipping a little bit, say, does America take philosophy seriously? One might as well ask whether America takes monarchy seriously. Joking about philosophy in the United States or just ignoring it comes with the territory, like learning the Pledge of Allegiance. Hard-boiled, concrete-minded descendants of everyone from the Pilgrims to the slaves to the boat people, we pick it up along the way, like mistrusting politicians, refinancing mortgages, or choosing whiz-bang smartphones. It's the way we're supposed to think about a discipline described by Ambrose Bierce, who promptly disappeared into the desert, not that far from here, as, quote, a route of many roads leading from nowhere to nothing. Great definition of philosophy. And by historian Henry Adams as a field that offers, quote, unintelligible answers to insoluble problems, unquote. Tocqueville, that touchstone for all synoptic thinking about America, thought the peculiar attitude of its residents toward philosophy so obvious that he began the second volume of Democracy in America by noting it, quote, I think that in no country in the civilized world is less attention paid to philosophy than in the United States. The Americans have no philosophical school of their own, and they care but little for all the schools into which Europe is divided, the very names of which are scarcely known to them, unquote. Back to me. Even Tocqueville, however, nodded. For all his general insight into the fledgling United States, he, like many French intellectuals, saw American thought through the prism of European customs and assumptions. The conclusion he drew from that putative intellectual state of affairs, that, quote, in most of the operations of the mind, each American appeals only to the individual effort of his own understanding, unquote, was false then and is even more false now. His misstep came in using the word only. He should have written that each American also appeals to the individual effort of his own understanding. And then the next paragraph is what we call in journalism the nut graph. It's probably the paragraph that most encompasses my main message in the book. For the surprising little secret of our ardently capitalist, famously materialist, heavily iPodded, iPadded, and iPhone society is that America in the early 21st century towers as the most philosophical culture in the history of the world, an unprecedented marketplace of truth and argument that far surpasses ancient Greece, Cartesian France, 19th century Germany, or any other place one can name over the past 3 millennia. And my next sentence is a kind of condensation of some of the arguments in the book. The openness of its dialogue, the quantity of its arguments, the diversity of its viewpoints, the cockiness with which its citizens express their opinions, the vastness of its First Amendment freedoms, the intensity of its hunt for evidence and information, the widespread rejection of truths imposed by authority or tradition alone, the resistance to false claims of justification and legitimacy, the embrace of net communication with an alacrity that intimidates the world, all corroborate that fact. Mistaking American ribbing of philosophy for what the British call rubbishing for evidence of a non-philosophical culture is only one of the errors traditionally committed by intellectuals in understanding the United States. Even the best philosophical societies, after all, stick it to philosophy once in a while, as Aristophanes caricatured Socrates and his Athenian logic choppers in The Clouds. American irreverence, far from posing a threat to philosophical activity, fuels and incarnates it. So I then go on in the introduction, to talk about the various ways that America is not philosophical. In fact, my introduction is argument after argument for why America is unphilosophical before coming to my book, which argues the opposite. So at one point, before listing all of those examples, I write, acquiescing to America the philosophical requires seeing America in the new millennium as directly, ebulliently, and ordinarily philosophical in a way that remains utterly unappreciated by philosophers, media, and the general public alike. It is to see Americans as almost uniquely able, given their rude independence of mind, to pierce the chief metaphorical scam of desiccated, moribund, yet still breathing Socratic philosophy, the justification language game that I examine in part 6 of this book. I'll say something about that later. It is to see the United States as the exemplar of a paradigm of philosophy long overdue for recognition, one with roots in the pragmatically accented view of the ancient Greek thinker Socrates that suits the 21st century and jives with accelerating trends of globalization in economics, politics, culture, ethics, and communication. Just a question I like to ask audiences. How many of you have ever heard of Socrates? Okay, a few, but not many. Not Socrates, in front of the Socrates, not the person you read in the Crito, Apologia, and so on. Socrates, by the way, was a little bit younger than Socrates, a little bit older than Plato, and I'll tell you something about him, later on. So I go on in the book to mention all these reasons that we might not think America is a philosophical culture. And I sum up that portion by talking about a whole genre of books. I know, a lot of people here are really interested in books, so I wanted to read this little part to you. A genre of books that basically is dedicated to deriding the United States as intellectual culture. So I write, finally, the views of some of our own intellectuals and authors threaten to put the last nail in the coffin of America the philosophical. Richard Feynman, 1918-1988, the feisty Nobel laureate in physics, regularly attacked philosophy as, quote, low-level baloney, unquote, and derided philosophers for always, quote, making stupid remarks, unquote, about science. Books trumpeting the low intellectual quality of American culture now constitute a genre of their own. In Idiot America, and this guy did accept his subtitle, How Stupidity Became a Virtue in the Land of the Free, magazine writer Charles Peirce, not to be confused with Charles Peirce, argued that we live in the land of his title, quote, the America of the medicine wagon and the tent revival, the America of the juke joint and the gambling den, unquote, that we remain, quote, the best country ever in which to peddle complete public lunacy, close quote. And I think if this book came out a few years later, he would have thrown Trump into that sentence. In Unscientific America, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future, authors Chris Mooney and Cheryl Kirschenbaum warned that America is, quote, home to a populace that, to an alarming extent, ignores scientific advances or outright rejects scientific principles, unquote, as well as a culture that, quote, all too often questions the value of intellect and even glorifies dumbness, unquote. The most vehement such book came from Susan Jacoby, a thoughtful journalist with a track record of serious works on the Soviet Union, retaliatory justice, secularism, and other weighty matters. Now, I won't read that long section on you, but I kind of criticize and take apart her book, The Age of American Unreason, as I start to move toward my own thesis. So I mention a lot of things then that, to me, count in favor of America the philosophical. But this book is a combination of reportage and philosophical argument. It was very hard, to pull off. I wanted the intellectuals to like this book and to see an argument in it, but I wanted the general reader to enjoy it. I wanted to have fun. There's wordplay, jokes, things like that. It's a trade book. So in this part of the introduction, though, I do try to explain, in a way, the architecture of my argument. I write, the status of America as a philosophical culture is thus not an open and shut case, but to bring the notion of America the unphilosophical, a deeply embedded commonplace about our country, crashing down like the Berlin Wall, requires more. To defeat the idea on a serious analytic and cultural plane, a full-scale assault on the misconception is necessary, delivered through 7 separate efforts at cliché crushing. And this is the brief summary of what I will run you through quickly afterwards. 1, an overview of the official American philosophical tradition as a tale not of argument machines, but of human beings who got things both right and wrong. 2, a broadly repertorial account of how non-professional philosophers have co-opted many of America's philosophical challenges and issues, and how astute cultural criticism recognizes their work as philosophical. 3, an equally concrete picture of how former outsiders, African Americans, women, gays, and Native American thinkers have expanded America's philosophical tent. 4, a telling chronicle of a wholly fresh and distinctive genre of philosophy in America, cyber philosophy. 5, a radical explanation of how American philosophy operates under the sign of I Socrates, not Socrates, whose acolyte Plato pulled off one of intellectual history's great public relations triumphs by identifying philosophy with Socrates' approach and denying the term to I Socrates' method. I'll explain that in a bit. 6, a fresh conceptual vision of why Americans reject supposedly airtight justifications for confidently asserted positions in philosophy and other areas of life, a tale best told through the mighty achievement but ultimate failure of America's most honored modern philosopher, John Rawls. And finally, 7, a summing up that argues how all of these forces help explain why, in the person of Barack Obama, we've ended up with our most cosmopolitan philosopher-in-chief president since Woodrow Wilson. So that's my last chapter. This came out in 2012. And one of the interesting things in recent times, of course, has been saying, hey, Romano, can we have like a massive book burning of your book in the Trump administration? You know, forget that Obama chapter. You think America's philosophical these days? Well, I do still. So I'll explain that. This is the end of the introduction. The image of America, the unphilosophical, persists because conventional academics and pundits continue to identify all philosophy with a Socratic approach, despite its undermining over the past century and a half by critics from Nietzsche and Wittgenstein to the pragmatists. That identification now stands recognized as wrong-headed in a globalized world in which multiple notions of truth, knowledge, beauty, and other core concepts continually open up to new audiences. As scholar and former economist, executive editor Anthony Gottlieb concluded when he tried to wrap his arms around the history of philosophy from the ancient Greeks to the Renaissance, quote, "The history of philosophy is more the history of a sharply inquisitive cast of mind than the history of a sharply defined discipline," unquote. The traditional image of it as a sort of meditative science of pure thought, strangely cut off from other subjects, is largely a trick of the historical light, unquote. That's still Anthony. Americans have thus not so much evaded philosophy in the provocative phrase of Cornel West, as they've sidestepped antiquated conceptions of it. In the post-positivist, post-Cold War, pan-Google era in which we live, America the philosophical, the country, not the book, can be seen as a coruscating achievement in the pragmatist project that's been unfolding for centuries. It is a rough-hewn implementation of what truth, ethics, beauty, and a host of core philosophical notions must be in an interdependent nation and world village, no longer able to ignore variant traditions and conceptual categories of others, but equally unwilling to give up the notion that some beliefs are better than others. Our country is not idiot America, but isocratic America, a place where the battle between dogma and doggedness in seeking answers never ends from sea to shining sea. End of introduction. Let me do you a quick run through here, just of some of the things I do in the book, and then we'll open it up. So, being a journalist and a writer, I thought it's important in a book of this sort to draw people in with some nice journalistic fun detail at the beginning. So I have a section called Therapists, Bootstrappers, Infantry. I write about one philosopher named Lou Marinoff, who thinks philosophers should do the job that therapists and psychologists and psychiatrists do. He wrote a funny book called Plato, Not Prozac. Lou was an interesting guy. And, when I challenged him on something in an interview, he said, now, come on, do you need a degree in psychiatry to get on the New York subway and decide that person in the corner is crazy? Part of his argument. so that's a fun part. Then I do something called Parsing America, in which I try to think about the concept of America, and I treat a number of books. Again, as a longtime book critic, I tend to think through books, so there are a lot of critical evaluation of books in my own book. I'm thinking about Michael Walzer, what it means to be an American, and other such books. I then do a very long section, about 60 pages or so, that I call Great White Men and the Ivy League Cavalcade, in which I essentially give a potted history, conventional history of the people who have been considered philosophers, mainly white men, starting with Emerson, and going on to other classic pragmatists. I write about Dewey and James and Peirce. I shoot forward to modern philosophers like Quine, Robert Nozick, Arthur Danto, Stanley Cavell, but try to present them as people, not just philosophers, and try to indicate how their personal lives often made a difference in the way they thought. I was telling Jeffrey an anecdote from the book. For instance, Robert Nozick, famous philosopher, no longer with us, great philosopher, brilliant, but had a kind of zigzag career. He was famous as a conventional piecemeal analyst in the analytic tradition. And at one point he thought, I don't like thinking of myself that way. I don't like slamming people down with my greater argumentative ability. I want to be more existentialist. So again, I'm a reporter. I interviewed a lot of people for this book. One of his old-time friends told me when he decided to become creative, he went to the Widener Library at Harvard. He was one of the youngest people ever to get tenure at Harvard. And he systematically went through all the poetry books of women who, in order to find poets who were both great poets and also beautiful, because he had gotten divorced, he ended up having an affair with the poet A.I., you may know of her, and marrying the poet Gertrude Schnackenberg, who is both a great poet and quite beautiful and alluring and so on. So he seemed to have achieved his goal there. But again, if you read the book that came out of it, The Examined Life, you might read it with a different sort of insight if you know that story. And in a similar way, when I write about other philosophers, Peirce, who ended up having quite a strange life, I think you can understand that these people were not just argument machines. I then close that out with a long section called Rorty's Revolution. You may know the philosopher Richard Rorty. I was his assistant at Princeton when he was writing Philosophy and the Mirror of Nature. He had a great influence on me. We didn't agree on everything, but I think he made a major difference in philosophy, in bringing philosophy down from the clouds and trying to understand it as a humanistic discipline. So I use him to kind of close off that long tradition of official philosophers. In the second section, I talk about persuasion, and I go outside the philosophy profession to talk about a lot of people who have thought about what persuasion means. How do we actually convince people in the range between, mighty tomes and treatises full of maybe syllogistic argument to pointing a gun at somebody's temple and saying, "You agree with me?" Persuasion doesn't get the attention it should from philosophers. I then, in this section, which I call Abandoning Toothless Truth, Other White Males Muscle In, I write about white males outside philosophy. I write about psychologists and psychiatrists, Robert Cole, Abraham Maslow, B.F. Skinner, people who I see as philosophers, even though they weren't philosophy professors. I write about literary critics, Harold Bloom, for instance, Kenneth Burke, political theorists like Fukuyama. I write about the linguist George Lakoff and Oliver Sacks, all people who I think made important philosophical points in their work without being philosophers. I have a section called The Casual Wise Men, which maybe was the most controversial of these sections because I included Hugh Hefner. And Umberto Eco, who was an old friend and gave me a nice blurb for my book, even he said to me, "Carlino, I think you are going to have a problem with Hugh Hefner." And he was right. But I actually spent the day with Hefner. I interviewed him at length. People don't realize the extent to which he was a word man. I mean, he built that empire on the words he originally wrote. There's actually a tome called The Playboy philosophy, which collects a lot of his pieces. Now, of course, feminists disagree about Hefner. I mean, I would say the bulk of them see him as someone who objectified women and was very bad for women and so on. But there is a strong minority who think he contributed to sexual liberation for women and have a subtler view on it. Almost everybody agrees that he was a great civil rights champion. He funded awards. The Bertrand Russell Society was going to give him their award. First person to have black jazz musicians on his TV show. Playboy had lots of Nobel Prize winning writers. But of course, I did this as a provocation. Yeah, he's on the border. Is he a philosopher? Is it obvious that he can't be seen as a philosopher? So he's in that section of casual wise men. I also have print journalists like Christopher Hitchens, Bill Moyers as a broadcaster. Again, trying to push the envelope of who's a philosopher. Next section of the book, part 3, I call the Rising Outsiders. I talk about the history of African-American philosophy, really going back to the 19th century, coming forward through the Harlem Renaissance, talking about contemporary philosophers like Cornel West, Michael Eric Dyson. I have a very long section on the history of women in philosophy. You might find it fun to know that in the many reviews, I had something like 60 mass media reviews of this book. Several reviewers said that I had a disproportionately long section on women in philosophy. No woman reviewer came to that point. I don't think it's disproportionately long. I think it's short, actually, given the history of women in philosophy. And one of the glorious things recently in philosophy is that a lot of women in philosophy have really recovered the tradition of women in philosophy. One of my old friends, Eileen O'Neill, who tragically died of cancer this past fall, one of the leading scholars. If you're interested in this, Eileen O'Neill, look up her work. Did a magnificent job of recovering the texts of women in philosophy. And of course, one of the reasons women didn't get the attention they should in the early modern period is that they're not publishing books, they're writing letters, they're writing in diaries, and so on. So we've had to alter our genre conception of philosophy to recover them. I have a short section on Native American philosophy. One reviewer said Mr. Romano's ridiculously scant treatment of Native American philosophy, to which my retort is, compared to who? Because, most books have absolutely nothing. I was trying to at least betoken the importance of that. I have a section on gays in philosophy, which was attacked because I mainly talk about Michel Foucault and Ludwig Wittgenstein, who, you may know, were not Americans. But I'm trying to make the point in that section that the American philosophy profession has done a very bad job in regard to gay issues, as it does a very bad job in regard to communication, journalism, and many parts of the real world. A fourth section I call Gutenberg's Revenge, the Explosion of Cyber Philosophy. I'll shoot quickly there through the topic just to say that it reflects a course I sometimes teach, cyber philosophy, which is books about the effect of the digital revolution on different areas of life. And the effects have been enormous. Anybody here who's ever done any dating online, internet dating, may think that, Tinder and things like that have really changed the way people operate in regard to seeking partners. One cliche is that it's made people more callous. If there used to be 4 people in the village you might be interested in, now there's like 5 million people you could possibly connect with. And therefore the criteria become kind of instant. Oh, I don't like, your fingernail. Goodbye. So it's had a big effect on dating. It's had a big effect on religion. There was a big controversy some years ago about whether to get a minyan in the Jewish religion, people still had to come together physically, or could they just log on? Is that good enough? Right? Every religion has actually faced challenges to its rituals because of the digital revolution. So I have sections there on cyber politics, cyber religion, cyber literature, in which I talk about Michael Joyce, who I see is coming, very important figure in cyber literature. And then a final section that I call cyber cynics, books by thinkers who doubt the importance of the digital revolution. Nothing really changes, they argue. All of this is overwrought. And people have drunk the digital Kool-Aid, and not recognized. As one of my authors, says that every time you introduce a digital system to replace a paper system, productivity goes down when you count in all the glitches and all the problems and so on. So that's the cyber philosophy part of the book. Part 5, Isocrates. Here I like my own subtitle, a man, not a typo. I went around Plaka, which some of you may know is the tourist section of Athens, trying to find a little figurine of Isocrates. He's so forgotten that they've got everyone, Demosthenes, Aristotle. I said, "Do you have Isocrates?" And the answer I'd get, one guy said to me, "Isocrate. My cousin is named Isocrate." But no, there was an Isocrate back then? I said, "Yes." I said, "Don't have him." He's really, I found some little museum like down by Piraeus, that had a picture of him, but it's very hard to get any kind of picture of him. But Isocrates essentially was a philosopher by his own judgment. He used the word philosopher. He is often seen in the tradition as a rhetorician. He said, "I'm not a rhetorician." He's seen as a sophist, which is an insult. You don't care about truth. You make the weaker argument, the stronger argument. He was not a sophist. He said he was not multiple times. He cared about truth. But what he was not was a believer in absolutist definitions of concepts. So I sometimes think of him as the Richard Rorty of ancient Greece. He thought we deliberate in public and we make arguments and we come to consensus views on things. And your view in this culture may not be your view in that culture. He was a super patriot for Athens as against the other, Greek states. He's controversial in various ways, but he's enormously, I think, contemporary. And in the final section of that part of the book that I call Isocrates, Greece and America, I note that many of the founding fathers were quite familiar with Isocrates. His traditional profile is as the father of rhetoric. And as a result, he was taught, when people still taught Greek and Latin, he was taught a great deal in 18th century America. So people were familiar with his ideas on deliberation. 2 quick endings. Part 6, just saying no to justification, the magnificent failure of John Rawls. Some of you may know John Rawls, widely considered the great political philosopher of the last, 75 years, A Theory of Justice. This was my worst chapter, according to my editor. He said it was too theoretical, too philosophical, not in harmony with the rest of the book. This is why editors are a good thing. He was quite right. And I went back and I realized I hadn't made that biographical in the way that I made my cavalcade of traditional American thinkers biographical. And so I started to learn more about John Rawls, because when I was an undergraduate at Princeton and we had to read the whole Theory of Justice, he was a very abstract figure, a stick figure. We knew the theory of justice, we knew the difference principle, all these abstract things, but we didn't know anything about John Rawls except he's a big professor at Harvard, and he's not interviewed very much because he actually stutters, and there's almost no biographical material on him. So what did I learn? Lots of amazing things. He wrote the index to Walter Kaufmann's Nietzsche biography. Walter Kaufmann, a figure quite different from to make $500 when he was a graduate student. Interesting for philosophy types. But more importantly, what I learned was that growing up in Baltimore, 2 of his siblings died as children because they caught illnesses from him. So one little brother was told, don't play with Jack. He's sick with this illness, but they didn't listen. The brother died. John survived. It actually happened a second time. Quite astonishing. Later in life, Rawls is in the U.S. Army in the Philippines, and then he's in Japan. And in one very crucial moment for him, his commanding officer comes to him with his best friend and says, "Listen, we got 2 jobs to do. One of you needs to come with me. We're going over there. And the other one needs to give blood. It depends on blood type." So Rawls has the right blood type to give blood. He goes to give blood. His commanding officer and his buddy go off to do that other task, and they're killed that day. What these bits of biography showed me that, justice was not a concept that John Rawls took off a shelf, like, what am I going to do my dissertation on? It was crucial to his thinking about the chanciness of life, and how wrong life often is, how many people suffer. I mean, have you ever spent any time in a children's hospital? I've spent a lot of time in the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. It teaches you something about fairness in life, right? So I tried to build that into the chapter. And what I argue eventually is that his theory of justice really didn't convince a lot of people, even in philosophy. And even one of his chief acolytes, his name is Thomas Poga, teaches at Yale, at one point declared, the theory is not successful. My epilogue to the book is called Obama, Philosopher in Chief. And what I try to argue there is not that, every president is philosophical, but that we have had a tradition of philosophical presidents, Jefferson, Lincoln, Wilson, and so on. That Obama himself is actually extremely literate in philosophy. If you trace his history at Occidental, and then at Columbia, at Harvard. I once wrote a long piece out of Brazil for the Chronicle on Roberto Mangabeira Unger, a very well-known political philosopher, Brazilian, who was Obama's professor. And he told me, my God, I had such long philosophical debates about people like Reinhold Niebuhr with Obama when he was a student. He's really read a lot. And later, when Obama becomes a candidate and a politician, he is enormously playing down his intellectual side. It will be interesting to see what his books are like in this post-presidential period, because previous to becoming a senator, he really talked a heavily intellectual game with his professors and so on. But what I basically say in that chapter is that, if he was our, in that line of philosophical presidents, it makes a certain sense because we are the great philosophical country we are, and it could be appreciated in a candidate. Although, as we've seen since, you don't have to be a philosopher to become president of the United States. I'll stop there, and thank you for listening.